You do what good imperial citizens are supposed to do. You have faith in the Emperor's protection. You don't yet realize that that your world has already begun its descent into something far worse than death. You don't understand that chaos has taken root in your world, and nothing will ever be the same again. In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates worse than simple death. One of the most horrifying is to watch your entire world slowly consumed by the forces of chaos, to see reality itself twist and corrupt around you, to witness friends and family transform into monsters, and to face a choice between a quick death or eternal damnation. This is not a quick annihilation by Xenos raiders or a clean execution by the Arbites. This is a slow, inexorable slide into madness and corruption that can take months or even years to complete. Chaos corruption is insidious. It doesn't announce itself with fanfare or obvious signs at first. It begins in the shadows, in whispered conversations, in secret meetings held in the deepest parts of underhives and behind the closed doors of noble estates. It spreads like a disease, but not one that simply kills. Instead, it transforms, corrupts, and ultimately consumes everything it touches. The Chaos Gods hunger constantly for mortal souls, and when they turn their terrible attention to a world, that world's doom is all but assured, unless swift and brutal action is taken. The Imperium of Man spans 1,000,000 worlds across the galaxy, and on countless thousands of these worlds, chaos cults work in the darkness, preparing for the day when their gods will reward them with power and transformation. Most of these cults are discovered and purged before they can cause catastrophic damage. The Inquisition's agents work tirelessly to root out heresy. The Arbites maintain order through fear and violence, and the Ecclesiarchy preaches the Emperor's divinity to billions upon billions of souls. But sometimes, through incompetence, bad luck, or the sheer determination of the cultists, a world falls too far before anyone in authority realizes what's happening. When that occurs, the inhabitants of that world experience something that defies description. They watch as their reality crumbles piece by piece. The laws of physics that govern their existence begin to fail. The dead don't stay dead. The sky changes color. Time itself becomes unreliable. And through it all, they must make impossible choices about survival, about morality, about what they're willing to do to protect themselves and those they love. The seeds of corruption, how it starts. Chaos corruption doesn't begin with demons materializing in the town square or reality tearing apart. It begins much more quietly, much more insidiously. It begins with people who are desperate, angry, afraid, or simply curious about powers beyond the Imperium's rigid doctrine. It begins in the dark corners where the Emperor's light doesn't quite reach, where his protection seems like an empty promise rather than a tangible reality. The Imperium of Man is a deliberately oppressive regime. It has to be. With 1,000,000 worlds to govern and countless threats both internal and external, the Imperium maintains control through fear, faith, and overwhelming force. Life for the average Imperial citizen is one of grinding labor, minimal comforts, and constant surveillance. You work until you're too old or injured to be useful, and then you're processed into corpse starch to feed the next generation of workers. Your children are taken for military service or labor assignments. Your thoughts are monitored for heresy. Your every action is scrutinized for signs of deviation from the approved norms. This oppression, while necessary from the Imperium's perspective to maintain unity across such a vast empire, creates the perfect breeding ground for resentment. People who feel powerless begin to look for alternatives. Those who've lost everything to the uncaring machinery of the Imperium's bureaucracy seek revenge. The ambitious, who are denied advancement through legitimate means, are tempted by promises of power through other avenues. And into this fertile ground of discontent, chaos plants its seeds. The 4 major chaos gods each offer something different. something tailored to human weakness and desire. Khorne, the blood god, appeals to those consumed by rage and the desire for martial prowess. In a galaxy where violence is constant and life is cheap, Khorne's promise of strength through bloodshed resonates with soldiers tired of watching their comrades die, with workers brutalized by their overseers, with anyone who's been made to feel weak and wants the power to strike back. His cultists don't necessarily understand they're worshipping a chaos god at first. They might think they're praying to a warrior saint or an aspect of the emperor himself. They conduct secret fight clubs, blood sports, gladiatorial contests. They tell themselves it's just stress relief, just a way to blow off steam. But with each death, with each skull claimed, they feed Khorne's power and draw his attention. Nurgle, the Plague Lord, offers acceptance and relief from suffering. In a universe where plague and disease are rampant, where medical care is a luxury most can't afford, where bodies break down from toxic working conditions and environmental contamination, Nurgle's promise of embracing decay instead of fighting it has a perverse appeal. His cults often begin as support groups for the sick and dying, communities that come together to care for those society has abandoned. They tell each other that suffering is natural, that decay is just another part of life's cycle, that death isn't something to fear. They practice folk medicine and use treatments that seem to help at first, but slowly, subtly, they begin to see disease not as something to cure, but as something to celebrate. They start to believe that Grandfather Nurgle loves them in a way the distant emperor never could. Slaanesh, the Prince of Pleasure, targets those seeking sensation, perfection, or simply escape from the grinding monotony of imperial life. Artists, musicians, nobles bored with their privileged existence, workers who want more than endless labor, all can fall prey to Slaanesh's allure. The cult might begin as a philosophical society discussing banned literature, an art collective exploring forbidden aesthetics, or simply a group seeking pleasure through drugs, music, and sensual experiences. They convince themselves they're not doing anything wrong. Imperium's restrictions on such things are just another form of control. They chase ever greater heights of sensation, ever more perfect artistic achievement, ever more intense experiences. And with each new indulgence, they fall deeper into Slaanesh's grasp. Tzeentch, the changer of ways, appeals to those who crave knowledge, change, and the power that comes from understanding forbidden truths. In an imperium that treats knowledge as dangerous and change as heretical, Tzeentch finds ready converts among scholars frustrated by restrictions on their research, psychers who want to understand their powers beyond the limited training the Imperium provides, and anyone who believes the rigid imperial system needs to change. His cults often disguise themselves as secret societies, fraternal organizations, or academic circles. They study forbidden law, practice unsanctioned sorcery, and pursue knowledge the Imperium has deemed too dangerous for mortal minds. They believe they're enlightening themselves, transcending the limitations the Imperium imposes. They don't realize they're dancing to a god's tune until it's far too late. The early days of a cult's formation are crucial. They must remain hidden, must avoid drawing the attention of the Arbites or, worse, the Inquisition. They recruit carefully, targeting the vulnerable, the angry, the curious. They use front organizations, legitimate businesses, charitable groups, even variants of the imperial cult itself, to mask their true nature. A workers' union advocating for better conditions, a circle that worships Khorne. A monastery devoted to caring for plague victims might secretly serve Nurgle. An artists' collective might be a front for Slaanesh worship. A philosophical society might be studying the works of Tzeentch. The cult members wear their masks well. During the day, they're model citizens. They attend the mandatory prayer sessions. They inform on their neighbors for minor infractions to deflect suspicion. They work their shifts and pay pay their tithes and bow to the planetary governors enforcers. But at night, in hidden chambers deep beneath the hive cities, in abandoned warehouses, in the private chapels of corrupt nobles, they gather to worship their dark gods. They perform rituals copied from forbidden texts. They make sacrifices, at first animal, then eventually human. They speak prayers in languages that hurt the mind to hear. They draw symbols that seem to writhe and move in the flickering candlelight. And slowly, very slowly, they grow in number and power. Each new recruit is a victory, the corpse emperor. They don't yet realize they're pawns in a game far beyond their comprehension. They don't understand that the Chaos Gods care nothing for their individual lives or dreams. They're tools to be used and discarded, fuel for powers that view mortal existence as barely more significant than we might view the lives of bacteria. But by the time they realize this truth, if they ever do, it's far too late to turn back. The cult grows. It spreads through families, through social networks, through professional associations. A factory worker recruits his shift supervisor. A noble brings her friends into the fold. A priest of the imperial cult, disillusioned by years of preaching to people who suffer endlessly despite their faith, begins to wonder if perhaps there are other gods who might actually answer prayers. The infection spreads from person to person, from district to district, from social class to social class. The rise of the cults, hidden among us. As the cult grows in size and confidence, it must become more sophisticated in its operations. What began as a handful of true believers meeting in secret becomes an organization that requires structure, hierarchy, and careful planning to avoid detection. The cult develops internal ranks, with the most devoted and powerful members forming an inner circle, while newer or less committed members remain on the periphery, often unaware of the cult's true nature and ultimate goals. The cult's public face becomes increasingly important. They establish front organizations that serve real, legitimate purposes while funneling resources and recruits to the hidden core. A charitable organization that provides food to the poor might be using its distribution network to identify vulnerable targets for recruitment. A merchant house that trades across the hive might be moving not just goods, but forbidden texts, cult paraphernalia, and messages between different cells. A labor union fighting for workers' rights might have a leadership that sees chaos as the ultimate revolution against an oppressive system. These fronts are carefully chosen to blend into the fabric of imperial society. In a hive world's administrative sector, the cult might disguise itself as a clerk's social club, using the trust and camaraderie of overworked bureaucrats to slowly introduce heretical ideas. In the underhive, they might pose as a gang or protection racket, indistinguishable from the countless other criminal enterprises that operate below the sight of imperial authorities. In noble circles, they might be a secretive art society or a philosophical discussion group where the wealthy and bored can indulge in forbidden knowledge without fear of being associated with common criminals. The cult's leadership typically emerges from those who show the greatest devotion or who demonstrate psychic potential. These are the cult demagogues, charismatic figures who can inspire others to greater acts of heresy, who can justify the increasingly horrific things the cult does in service to their dark gods. Some are true believers, utterly convinced of their chosen deity's righteousness. Others are cynical manipulators who see the cult as a path to personal power. Many are former imperial officials, priests who lost their faith, military officers cashiered for infractions, or nobles who've grown bored with conventional power and seek something more. These leaders conduct the cult's most important rituals, the ones that go beyond simple worship and begin to actively invoke the powers of chaos. They might use forbidden psychic abilities to contact entities in the warp, entities that whisper secrets and promises into their minds. They conduct increasingly elaborate sacrifices, sometimes of animals, sometimes of unwilling victims, kidnapped from the streets or taken from the ranks of the cult's enemies. They study ancient texts recovered from Xenos ruins, or passed down through generations of cultists, learning rituals that were old when humanity first reached for the stars. As the cult's power grows, strange things begin to happen. Small at first, easily dismissed or ignored. A cultist who should have died from injuries survives through what seems like a miracle. Another develops the ability to influence people's thoughts, subtly at first, then more overtly. Objects in the cult's shrines seem to move on their own or whisper in languages no human should understand. The cult's leaders begin to display physical changes, marks of favor from their patrons, though they hide these carefully from outsiders. The cult also begins to infiltrate positions of real authority. A cultist who works in the administratum might alter records to hide the cult's activities or make their enemies disappear on paper. One who joins the Arbites can warn of upcoming raids or misdirect investigations. A cultist in the Planetary Defense Force can arrange for weapons to be lost in inventory, only to end up in the cult's hands. This infiltration is patient work, sometimes taking years or even decades, but it's essential for the cult's survival as it grows too large to hide entirely. Perhaps most insidiously, the cult begins to corrupt the imperial cult itself from within. They recruit priests and preachers who can twist the imperial creed's teachings to serve chaos. These corrupted clergy preach sermons that subtly introduce heretical concepts while maintaining a veneer of orthodoxy. They might emphasize the emperor's warrior aspect while secretly channeling devotion to Horn, or focus on accepting suffering as the emperor's will while actually serving Nurgle. The congregation doesn't realize they're being led astray. They think they're being model imperial citizens, attending services and offering prayers, while actually feeding power to the ruinous powers. The cult's meetings grow larger and more frequent. What started as small gatherings of a few believers becomes ceremonies involving dozens or even hundreds of participants. They meet in abandoned sectors of the hive, in caves beneath the city, in mansions where the wealthy can indulge without fear of the common law. These gatherings become increasingly elaborate, with ritualistic elements drawn from forbidden lore. They chant in languages that hurt the throat to speak and the ears to hear. They carve symbols into walls, floors, their own flesh. They offer sacrifices and conduct rites that would horrify any loyal imperial citizen. During these rituals, the barrier between the material world and the warp begins to thin. The cultists might catch glimpses of things that exist beyond reality, shadows of the demons that serve their gods. They hear voices, see visions, experience sensations that no mortal should be able to endure. Some go mad from these experiences. Others are strengthened in their conviction, seeing these horrors as proof that they have touched something real and powerful, something the Imperium's lies about the Emperor's protection can't match. The cult also begins to create its own infrastructure. They establish safe houses where members can hide from Imperial authorities. They set up networks for distributing forbidden materials, for moving people between cells, for coordinating activities across different parts of the hive or even different cities. They develop codes and secret signs so members can recognize each other and communicate without being obvious. They create their own hierarchy of ranks and titles, often mocking the imperial system's rigid structure. Some cultists begin to develop mutations, physical changes that mark them as touched by chaos. These might be small at first, easily hidden beneath clothing. An extra finger, skin that changes color, eyes that glow faintly in the dark. The cult's leadership treats these as marks of favor, signs that the gods have noticed and blessed the individual. They teach the mutants to hide their changes from outsiders while displaying them proudly within the cult's gatherings. The mutations are tangible proof that their worship isn't in vain, that real power flows from their devotion. But not everyone in the cult is a true believer. Some join out of fear, having witnessed the cult's power and deciding it's safer to go along than to resist. Others are there for more mundane reasons: the social connections, access to resources, protection from hive gangs or other threats. These lukewarm members are often kept in the dark about the cult's true nature, forming outer circles that can be sacrificed if the cult is discovered. They think they're part of a fraternal organization or political movement, not understanding the depth of heresy at the cult's core. As months turn to years, the cult becomes embedded in the world's society, like cancer in living tissue. They're in the governorship's administration, in the Arbeits, in the PDF, in the merchant guilds, in the workers' unions, everywhere. They've become a shadow government, wielding real power while maintaining the fiction that everything is under imperial control. The legitimate authorities don't realize how compromised they've become, or if some do suspect, they're too afraid to act, knowing that accusations without proof can be as dangerous as the heresy itself. The cult is patient. They know that acting too soon, revealing themselves before they're ready, will bring the Imperium's wrath down upon them. So they wait, recruiting more members, performing more rituals, bringing their dark god's attention more firmly upon their world. They're laying the groundwork for something terrible, something that will transform their entire world, and most of the population has no idea it's happening. Early signs and denial, when reality begins to crack. The first signs that something is deeply wrong are easy to dismiss. They're small aberrations, the kind of things people can rationalize away if they try hard enough. And try they do, because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate. It starts with minor strangeness. A street that should be familiar somehow looks different, though you can't quite say how. The shadows seem longer than they should be, falling at wrong angles. The number of rats in the underhive increases dramatically, and they seem to be watching people with an intelligence that vermin shouldn't possess. Dreams become more vivid, more disturbing, leaving people exhausted when they wake. Strange lights are seen in the sky at night, dismissed by officials as atmospheric phenomena or problems with the hive's atmospheric processes. People start going missing. At first, it's just the usual rate of disappearances that any hive city experiences. The homeless, the indigent, criminals, those who won't be missed or investigated. But gradually, the rate increases. A merchant's daughter vanishes on her way to morning prayers. A shift supervisor doesn't report for work and is never seen again. An entire gang in the underhive disappears overnight. Their territory empty, no signs of struggle or flight. The Arbeits investigate some cases, but their resources are limited, and the disappearances don't follow a pattern they can discern. Those who remain begin to notice behavioral changes in people they know. A neighbor who was always friendly becomes withdrawn and paranoid, muttering to themselves and painting strange symbols on their door. A co-worker starts speaking in odd phrases, using words that don't quite make sense in context. Children come home from school crying, saying their teacher's voice sounds wrong, sounds like multiple people speaking at once. But when parents investigate, everything seems normal. The teacher seems fine. The child must have been mistaken or making things up for attention. There are small physical anomalies too. Food spoils faster than it should, developing growths and molds that don't match any known biological contaminant. Water from the reclamation systems sometimes comes out tinted with colors. That shouldn't be there. Sickly greens, deep purples, colors that seem to shift and change when you're not looking directly at them. The air quality monitors show strange readings, fluctuations that the tech priests dismiss as equipment malfunction, but never quite manage to fix. The hive's servitors begin to malfunction more frequently. These cyborg slaves, their brains mostly replaced with cogitators, should be predictable and reliable. But they start to act erratically. One might stop mid-task and stare at nothing for hours. Another might repeat the same phrase over and over, something that isn't part of its programmed responses. Some simply cease functioning, their biological components rotting from within despite the preservatives that should keep them stable. The Adeptus Mechanicus sends tech priests to investigate, but they find no consistent cause for the malfunctions. Temperature fluctuations become more common. A section of the hive might suddenly become freezing cold. Frost, forming on metal walls despite the climate control systems. Then hours later, that same area might be sweltering hot, hot enough that workers collapse from heat exhaustion. The tech priests blame it on failing infrastructure, which is plausible enough in a hive that's millennia old. They make repairs, but the problems persist. Time itself seems to become unreliable. Workers report that their shifts seem to last longer or shorter than they should, though the chronometers say otherwise. People age faster than they should, their hair turning grey and skin wrinkling over the course of weeks. Others seem to not age at all, remaining unchanging even as months pass. Pregnant women give birth far too early or far too late, and the children born are often wrong in ways that are hard to articulate. They might be physically perfect, but their eyes are empty, or they might have subtle deformities that grow worse as they age. The planetary Vox network begins to experience strange interference. Broadcasts are interrupted by sounds that might be voices, speaking in languages no one recognizes. Sometimes music can be heard, haunting melodies that stick in the mind and leave listeners disturbed for days. The tech priests blame solar flares or equipment degradation, but the interference follows patterns that seem almost deliberate. Religious observances become problematic. Priests conducting services report that the words of familiar prayers sometimes come out wrong, twisted into phrases that sound almost blasphemous. Holy symbols crack and tarnish for no apparent reason. Saints' relics, housed in cathedrals, begin to decay or change, developing growths or discolorations that shouldn't be possible given their preservation. The ecclesiarchy sends investigators, but they find no evidence of deliberate desecration. They attribute it to environmental factors and order the relics restored. Animals begin to behave strangely. The groks in the agri levels become aggressive, attacking their handlers without provocation. Vermin breed at impossible rates, producing litters far larger than their species should be capable of. Some of the creatures born are malformed, sporting extra limbs or features that don't match their species. These aberrations are killed and incinerated, but they keep appearing. People start having similar nightmares. Workers across different shifts and different hive sectors report dreaming of the same things. Endless corridors that fold in on themselves, voices calling from the darkness, symbols that burn themselves into the mind's eye. They wake screaming, unable to shake the feeling that something was watching them in their sleep, something hungry and malevolent. But dreams are just dreams, aren't they? Stress and poor nutrition and the constant grind of imperial life can explain nightmares. Small groups of people begin to hear voices. Not the mechanical voices of voxcasters or servitors, but voices that seem to come from nowhere, whispering in. The quiet moments. The voices say different things to different people. Some hear promises of power and pleasure. Others hear warnings of doom. Still others hear commands, instructions to do things that range from harmless to horrific. Most people don't act on what the voices say, dismissing them as auditory hallucinations brought on by fatigue or stress. Some seek help from medical facilities, only to be told their brain scans are normal and they should get more rest. The rate of violent crime increases. Murders become more common and more brutal. The victims are found in positions that suggest ritualistic killings, their bodies arranged in patterns, often with symbols carved into their flesh. The Arbites crack down, making examples of those they catch. But for every killer they execute, 2 more seem to emerge. The violence has a pattern to it, though the investigators can't quite identify what it is. It's as if the city itself is becoming more aggressive, more hostile to life. Throughout all of this, the authorities maintain that everything is under control. The planetary governor gives speeches about law and order, about faith in the emperor, about how these minor disruptions are nothing to be concerned about. The Arbites increase patrols, but make no major changes to their procedures. The ecclesiarchy holds more prayer services, attributing the problems to moral laxity among the population that can be corrected through greater devotion. The tech priests work on infrastructure repairs, convinced that mechanical failures explain most of the anomalies. But underneath the official dismissals and explanations, people are afraid. They might not understand what's happening, but they can feel it. Something is deeply wrong with their world, something that all the prayers and all the enforcement can't fix. They lock their doors at night and keep their children close. They avoid the lower levels of the hive where the strangeness seems most concentrated. They pray more fervently, hoping that if they're devout enough, the emperor will protect them. They don't realize that the emperor's protection may no longer extend to their world. They don't know that the barriers between reality and the warp are thinning, that their planet is being targeted by powers far beyond their comprehension. They don't understand that many of their neighbors, their co-workers, perhaps even their family members, are part of a cult that's deliberately bringing this corruption upon them. The denial persists because the truth is too terrible. If they admitted what was really happening, they would have to admit that their world is doomed, that the Imperium might not be able to save them, that they might have to make impossible choices in the days ahead. So they cling to rationalizations and official explanations, even as the evidence of chaos corruption becomes harder and harder to ignore. But denial can only last so long. Eventually, the signs become too obvious, too pervasive, too undeniable. And when that breaking point comes, when the population can no longer pretend everything is normal, panic will follow. That's when the real horror begins. The first mutations. Bodies betray their owners. The human body is not meant to exist in a universe where the laws of physics are merely suggestions, where the fabric of reality can be twisted by malevolent intelligences from beyond space and time. When chaos corruption spreads across a world, one of the first and most horrifying manifestations is mutation. The transformation of human flesh into something else, something wrong. For the afflicted, it often begins with small changes. Perhaps you notice your fingernails have become harder, almost like claws, and they seem to be darkening from their base. You try to trim them, but they grow back impossibly fast. Maybe your teeth feel different when you run your tongue over them, sharper than they should be, and you realize with horror that you've developed extra molars where there shouldn't be any. Your reflection in the mirror looks slightly off, your features subtly rearranged in ways you can't quite identify, but that make you look almost like a stranger. The changes accelerate. Skin might develop patches of discoloration that spread like bruises but never fade. Some people's skin hardens, becoming leathery or scale-like. Others find their skin becoming translucent, blood vessels and muscle tissue visible beneath. Hair grows in wrong places, on the palms of hands, across the face in thick patches, down the spine. Or it falls out entirely, leaving smooth skin that feels cold and wrong to the touch. More dramatic mutations follow. Extra digits sprouting from hands or feet, limbs lengthening or shortening, bones cracking and reforming, eyes changing color, pupils becoming slitted like a reptile's, or multiplying until there are eyes where eyes should never be, mouths appearing in wrong places, on the palms of hands, the back of the neck, the torso. These mouths might whisper constantly in voices too quiet to understand, or they might scream, or they might try to bite anyone who comes close. For some, the mutations are tied to their emotions, or to the particular chaos power they've been exposed to. Those touched by Horn might find their muscles bulking up grotesquely, their body becoming a weapon even as their mind becomes consumed with rage. Their skin might turn red or develop brass-colored scales. Horns might erupt from their skull, growing painfully over days or weeks. They become more aggressive, more violent, finding it harder to control their anger. Nurgle's touch brings corruption of a different sort. Flesh becomes swollen and pustulent, covered in boils and lesions that never heal. The body begins to rot while still alive, skin sloughing off to reveal muscle and bone beneath. Yet somehow the victim continues to function. They might develop parasites, worms burrowing beneath their skin, flies laying eggs in their flesh that hatch into maggots. They should die from these afflictions, but Nurgle's blessing keeps them alive, keeps them suffering, keeps them spreading disease to everyone around them. Slaanesh's mutations are often beautiful at first, seductively attractive changes that make the afflicted more alluring, more perfect. Their features become symmetrical, their bodies lithe and graceful, but this perfection curdles into excess. Extra limbs sprout to better experience sensation. Skin becomes hypersensitive to the point of agony. Sensory organs multiply or mutate. Tongues split into multiple appendages. Noses develop dozens of nasal passages. Eyes gain new spectrums of vision that show horrors invisible to normal sight. Tzeentch's gifts are perhaps the most unpredictable. The god of change delights in transformation for its own sake. A victim might wake up to find their left arm has become tentacles, writhing with their own intelligence. Their eyes might see, through time, catching glimpses of possible futures that drive them mad. Their flesh might become unstable, shifting and changing constantly, never settling into a single form. Colors that don't exist in normal reality might emanate from their skin. They might develop psychic abilities they can't control, their thoughts accidentally broadcasting to everyone nearby, or reaching into the warp and pulling back things that should stay buried. The psychological impact of mutation is devastating. You look in the mirror and a monster stares back. The person you were, the human being with thoughts and feelings and relationships, is being consumed by this thing you're becoming. Some mutations are painful, constant agony as bones reshape and organs relocate. Others are simply wrong, violations of how a body should work, that your mind rebels against, even as your flesh accepts. Many of the mutated try desperately to hide their changes. They wear heavy clothing to conceal deformities. They avoid social contact to keep others from seeing what they've become. They mutilate themselves, cutting off extra digits or gouging out mutated eyes, only to have the changes return within days or hours. Some manage to hide their mutations for weeks or even months, living in constant fear of discovery, because discovery means death. The Imperium has no mercy for mutants. The official doctrine is clear. Mutation is a sign of chaos taint, and the mutant must be destroyed before they can spread their corruption. It doesn't matter if the mutation was unwilling, if the victim never sought out chaos, if they're horrified by what's happening to them. The Imperium can't risk allowing the taint to spread. Better to kill 1,000 innocents than let one true cultist escape. When mutants are discovered, the response is swift and brutal. The Arbites round them up and burn them publicly, making examples to terrify the population into vigilance. Neighbors are encouraged to inform on family members. Children are taught to report their parents if they see signs of mutation. The atmosphere becomes one of paranoid suspicion, everyone watching everyone else for telltale signs of physical corruption. Some mutants flee to the Underhive, seeking refuge in the depths where imperial authority is weakest. They form communities of the outcast, groups of mutated humans trying to survive in the darkness. But even there, they're not safe. Gangs hunt them for sport or out of superstitious fear. Other mutants, further gone in their corruption, might attack them. And sometimes chaos cults find these refugees and recruit them, offering acceptance in exchange for service to dark gods. The mutations don't stop. Once they begin, they typically accelerate. A small change leads to larger ones. The victim finds themselves transforming more rapidly, their human form becoming less and less recognizable. Their mind begins to change too, thoughts becoming alien urges rising up from somewhere deep inside. The boundary between human and monster blurs and eventually disappears. Some of the mutated embrace what's happening to them. They see their changes as blessings, gifts from gods that the Imperium denies exist. They join chaos cults willingly, offering themselves for further transformation, seeking to become something greater than human, even if that means losing their humanity entirely. They display their mutations proudly at cult gatherings, competing to show who has received the most dramatic blessings from their patron deity. But even among chaos worshippers, there's a limit to acceptable mutation. Those who transform too much, who accumulate too many changes too quickly, risk becoming chaos spawn, mindless, shapeless things that are barely alive, all intelligence and personality consumed by endless transformation. The chaos gods discard these failed servants, and even other cultists fear and avoid them. To become a spawn is considered a fate worse than death, proof that you failed to control the powers you sought to master. The appearance of mutations across the population is a clear sign that chaos has infected the world deeply. When the Inquisition investigates worlds suspected of corruption, one of the first things they look for is mutation rates above the baseline. Too many mutants means warp influence, and warp influence means the world is a candidate for extreme measures. But by the time mutations are common enough to be obvious to investigating authorities, it's often too late to save the world through conventional means. For the non-mutated population, living among the afflicted is a nightmare. You don't know who might be hiding mutations. Your spouse might be changing in ways they're concealing from you. Your children might be transforming in the night. Every person you encounter might be secretly corrupted, their human appearance a mask over something monstrous. The social fabric tears apart as trust evaporates and fear takes hold. And, through it all, the mutations spread. More people wake up to find themselves changing. More families are torn apart as members reveal their afflictions or are discovered and taken away. More communities in the underhive swell with refugees who have nowhere else to go. The world's population is dividing into the human and the post-human, and the line between them grows thinner with each passing day. The thinning veil, warp phenomena, manifests. As chaos corruption deepens its hold on a world, the barrier between reality and the warp begins to fail. This barrier, maintained in normal space by the natural laws of physics and the coherent beliefs of its inhabitants, starts to thin and crack. When this happens, the phenomena that manifest are beyond anything the human mind evolved to comprehend. Reality itself becomes unreliable, subject to forces that mock the very concept of natural law. Temperature becomes detached from any physical cause. A room might suddenly plunge to freezing, temperatures that cause frost to form on walls and make breath steam in the air, despite heating systems functioning perfectly. Moments later, that same room might become stiflingly hot, hot enough to blister skin, with no change in any environmental controls. These fluctuations don't follow patterns or make physical sense. A corridor might be comfortable, while the rooms on either side swing wildly between extremes. Workers trying to maintain the hive's systems find their instruments giving contradictory readings, saying the temperature is normal, even as people are suffering from heat stroke or hypothermia. Time begins to behave strangely. Chronometers that should be precisely synchronized show different times. People working side by side experience time at different rates. One person's hour might be another's minute or day. Workers enter rooms and emerge what feels like moments later to find hours or days have passed. Others work through what seems like an interminable shift, only to find they've been gone for mere minutes according to external time. Appointments become meaningless when no one can agree on when they occurred. The very concept of schedules breaks down as time becomes subjective and unreliable. The dead don't stay dead. Bodies in the mortuary sometimes sit up, their eyes opening even though their hearts don't beat and their lungs don't breathe. They might speak in voices that aren't their own, delivering messages that make no sense or prophesying horrors to come. Sometimes they attack the living with surprising strength before finally becoming still again. Other corpses simply vanish from sealed morgues, gone without explanation, sometimes seen walking the corridors hours or days later before disappearing again. Shadows develop substance and agency. They move independently of their sources, flowing across walls and floors in defiance of any light source. Some shadows show shapes that don't match the objects casting them. Human shadows that sprout, extra limbs or monstrous features. People report their shadows whispering to them or moving to attack them, while they themselves remain still. Certain areas accumulate shadows that don't dissipate even in bright light. Pools of darkness that seem to watch and wait. The laws of gravity become optional. Objects might suddenly float upward, defying gravity completely. People might find themselves walking on walls or ceilings as easily as floors. Or gravity might reverse in specific areas. Everything and everyone falling upward into the ceiling before gravity rights itself moments later, dropping them back to the floor. These reversals cause injuries and deaths, but also a creeping horror as people realize they can't trust something as fundamental as which direction is down. Sounds become divorced from their sources. Footsteps echo from empty corridors. Voices speak from walls or empty air, sometimes whispering, sometimes screaming. Music plays with no identifiable source, haunting. Melodies that stick in the mind and drive listeners slowly mad. The sounds aren't always audible in the normal way. Sometimes people hear them directly in their minds, sounds that bypass the ears entirely and resonate directly in consciousness. And the things these sounds say, when they're comprehensible at all, speak of horrors and revelations that shatter sanity. Visions plague the population. People see things that aren't there. Spectral figures moving through crowds, monstrous shapes lurking in shadows, impossible geometries in familiar architecture. Some see the past, moments from history playing out before them like projected images. Others see possible futures, visions of what might happen or what the chaos gods intend to bring about. These visions are vivid and real enough that people try to interact with them, reaching for phantoms or running from threats that exist only in their perceptions. Material objects begin to behave impossibly. Doors open into rooms that don't exist. Corridors that stretch for impossible distances before looping back on themselves. Rooms are larger on the inside than their exterior dimensions should allow. Staircases lead upward but somehow bring people back to where they started. The hive's geometry becomes non-Euclidean, its architecture defying the mathematics that should govern physical space. People get lost in areas they've known their entire lives, unable to find familiar landmarks that should be right in front of them. Electronics malfunction in ways that shouldn't be possible. Boxcasters pick up signals from sources that don't exist, broadcasting scenes from other worlds or other times. Data screens show information that wasn't input into any system, prophecies written in code, or images of places no human has ever seen. Servitors receive instructions from nowhere, commands that override their programming and make them perform actions their masters never ordered. Some machines seem to develop awareness, their deeds, machine spirits becoming genuinely intelligent and malevolent. Living things warp and change. Plants grow at impossible rates, vines spreading across walls in hours, developing thorns or flowers or fruits that are entirely new species. Animals mutate, developing features that don't match any known creature. Bacteria and microorganisms evolve in impossible directions, creating new diseases or simply refusing to follow biological laws. The boundary between living and non-living becomes blurred. Rocks might bleed when cut, metal might grow like a plant, organic matter might develop crystalline structures. The sky changes. On worlds with atmospheres, the sky's color shifts. Green, purple, red, colors that don't exist in normal light. The stars move in patterns they shouldn't follow. Multiple suns might appear in the sky, even though the system only has one star. At night, the darkness becomes absolute. Not the mere absence of light, but a presence, a thing that presses against windows and tries to seep through cracks. Looking at the sky for too long causes dizziness and nausea, a sense that something vast and terrible is looking back. Psychic phenomena erupt across the population. People who never showed psychic potential suddenly develop powers they can't control. They might read thoughts accidentally, broadcasting their own consciousness to everyone nearby. They might move objects with their minds, cause fires with a thought, or worse, open tiny rifts to the warp that let demons peek through for horrifying moments. These untrained psychers are incredibly dangerous, beacons that draw warp entities like blood draws sharks. Colors that don't exist in normal reality begin to appear. They can't be described because human language lacks the concepts, but those who see them know instinctively they're wrong, that they're colors that exist only in the warp and have no place in material space. These impossible hues spread like stains across surfaces, and anything they touch begins to warp and change, taking on properties it shouldn't have. The barriers between minds thin. People begin to hear each other's thoughts, unwillingly privy to the internal monologues of everyone around them. Dreams become shared experiences, entire populations trapped in the same nightmares. Memories leak from person to person, so you might remember events from someone else's life as if they were your own. Individual identity becomes harder to maintain when consciousness itself is becoming collective and permeable. Through all of this, the rational mind tries to find explanations. It's just hallucinations. It's mass hysteria. It's equipment failure and environmental contamination and psychological stress. To these explanations, even as they become increasingly absurd. They deploy more enforcers, conduct more investigations, issue more decrees demanding order and normalcy. But their efforts are futile. You can't enforce laws of physics that are breaking down. You can't arrest reality for failing to be real. The population's response varies. Some retreat into denial, refusing to acknowledge what they're experiencing. They go through the motions of normal life, even as reality collapses around them. Others panic, fleeing to areas they believe might be safer, though nowhere on the world is truly safe anymore. Some turn to religion, praying more fervently to the emperor for deliverance, conducting continuous services and flagellating themselves to prove their devotion. And some, seeing the Imperium's faith failing to protect them, begin to wonder if perhaps the chaos cults were right all along, if the dark gods might offer salvation where the emperor cannot. The cultists, of course, rejoice. These phenomena are proof that their gods are real and powerful, that their worship has borne fruit. They conduct more rituals, drawing more power from the warp, accelerating the corruption they've worked so hard to bring about. They see themselves as midwives to a new reality, helping their world transition from the lies of the Imperium to the truth of chaos. They don't yet realize that they too will be consumed by what's coming, that the gods they serve care nothing for their survival. Society crumbles, the breakdown of order. When reality itself becomes unreliable, the social structures that maintain civilization cannot survive. The descent into chaos begins subtly, but accelerates rapidly as each failure of authority creates space for greater disorder. A world that has maintained its functions for centuries, or even millennia, comes apart in a matter of weeks. The first systems to fail are often the most complex. Logistics and supply chains depend on precise coordination across vast distances, and when time becomes unreliable and communications are plagued by warp interference, that coordination becomes impossible. Food shipments don't arrive when scheduled, or arrive spoiled despite proper preservation. Water reclamation systems malfunction, producing water that's unsafe to drink or simply stopping production entirely. Power generation becomes erratic, with entire sectors of the hive plunging into darkness for hours or days at a time. The workers who maintain these systems are themselves affected by the corruption. Some have mutated to the point where they can no longer perform their duties. Others have gone mad from warp exposure, their technical knowledge intact, but their judgment fatally compromised. Still others have joined chaos cults and actively sabotaged the infrastructure they once maintained, seeing the collapse as necessary to usher in their god's dominion. The tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus try to keep systems functioning, but they're overwhelmed by the scale of the failures and confused by technology that increasingly refuses to obey the laws it was built upon. Law enforcement collapses in stages. The Arbites, already stretched thin across any hive world, find themselves dealing with a current surge in crime and civil disorder that exceeds their capacity to respond. The mutation purges have eliminated many of their officers, some because they were mutated, others because they were too sympathetic to the mutated to carry out their duties properly. The remaining Arbites become more brutal in their attempts to maintain order, which only increases resentment and resistance from the population. Worse, the Arbites themselves are infiltrated by chaos cultists. Officers who should be maintaining the Emperor's law are instead protecting cult activities and eliminating threats to the conspiracy. When loyal Arbites try to investigate corruption within their own ranks, they often disappear or are found dead in apparent suicides. The population loses faith in the enforcers, knowing that calling the Arbites might bring help or might bring death, with no way to tell which until it's too late. The civil government fares no better. The planetary governor and their administration, already compromised by cult infiltration, struggle to maintain even the appearance of control. Edicts are issued demanding order and increased production, but they're ignored because everyone knows the government can't enforce them. Some governors retreat into their palaces, surrounding themselves with guards and trying to pretend everything is fine even as their world burns. Others flee off-world if they can, abandoning their populations to save themselves. A few make genuine attempts to fight the corruption, but they lack the resources and often the knowledge to do so effectively. The ecclesiarchy should provide spiritual strength in such times, but it too is failing. Many priests are cultists who use their positions to spread heresy disguised as the imperial creed. Others have lost their faith, unable to reconcile the emperor's supposed protection with the horrors they're witnessing. The faithful priests preach ever more desperately, calling for prayer and repentance, but their congregations can see that faith alone isn't stopping the corruption. When prayers go unanswered and miracles don't materialize, people begin to question whether the emperor truly cares about their world. Economic systems break down as trade becomes impossible. Merchants can't transport goods when the routes are unsafe, and the destination might not exist in a few days. Currency becomes worthless when no one trusts that it will hold its value. Barter systems emerge, but even these falter when people realize that food and water they trade for might spoil within hours or transform into something inedible. The wealthy try to use their resources to secure safety, hiring mercenaries and building fortified compounds. But wealth means little when reality itself is the enemy. Violence explodes across the world. Gangs that once operated within certain boundaries go to war with each other and anyone else, knowing that law enforcement is no longer functional. Riots erupt over food shortages, access to water, or simply out of rage and fear at what's happening. The mobs attack government buildings, ecclesiarchy temples, Arbite stations, anyone or anything that represents the failing authority. They also attack suspected cultists, conducting their own brutal purges based on rumor and suspicion rather than evidence. Neighbor turns on neighbor. The paranoia and fear that have been building explode into violence. People settle old grudges, using the chaos as cover for murder and theft. Families fracture as members accuse each other of being cultists or mutants. Communities that once functioned together devolve into warring factions. The bonds of civilization, already strained, snap entirely in many areas. the cults emerge from hiding. With authority collapsing and the population divided, there's less reason to maintain secrecy. Cultists begin to operate openly, conducting rituals in public spaces, marking buildings with the symbols of their patron gods, recruiting new members from those desperate enough to seek any protection or purpose. They're still opposed by loyal imperial citizens, which leads to running battles in the streets between cultists and makeshift militias of the faithful. Some areas of the world maintain order longer than others. Military bases with disciplined troops and strong leadership might keep their sectors functional for weeks or months after other areas have descended into chaos. Noble houses with private armies can enforce law within their territory, but these islands of stability are besieged by refugees and attacked by cults, and eventually they too succumb to the spreading corruption. The planet's defense forces face an impossible situation. They're supposed to protect the world from external threats, but the threat is internal and pervasive. Some PDF regiments remain loyal to the Imperium and try to restore order, but they're often fighting their own corrupted members as much as outside threats. Other regiments have gone over to chaos entirely, their officers using military discipline to organize cult activities with terrifying efficiency. Still others simply break apart, soldiers deserting to protect their families or join the cults or simply try to survive. Communication between different regions breaks down. Vox networks are unreliable, often carrying only screams and mad laughter and inhuman voices. Physical travel becomes hazardous as roads and transit systems fail or are controlled by hostile forces. Entire cities or hive sections become isolated, cut off from news of what's happening elsewhere. Without information, coordinated resistance becomes impossible. Each area fights its own desperate battle without knowing if help is coming or if they're the last loyal forces left on the entire world. In the absence of legitimate authority, new power structures emerge. Warlords take control of sections of the hive, ruling through force and establishing their own brutal order. Some are loyal to the Imperium, in their way, maintaining the Emperor's law as they understand it. Others are cult leaders who have achieved temporal power along with spiritual authority. Still others are simply opportunists who see the chaos as a chance to seize power for themselves, caring nothing for either the Imperium or chaos. The infrastructure of daily life collapses completely in many areas. Water stops flowing. Power fails permanently. Waste disposal systems back up, flooding lower levels with sewage and toxic runoff. Ventilation fails, making areas uninhabitable as air becomes too toxic to breathe. Thousands die from these failures, deaths that have nothing to do with violence or corruption, but simply from the breakdown of the systems that make hive life possible. Food becomes the most precious resource. The agricultural levels stop producing as workers flee or die or join cults. Distribution networks are destroyed. Stores are looted and emptied within days. People turn to increasingly desperate measures to eat, raiding corpse starch processing plants, eating vermin, even consuming the dead. This malnutrition makes the population more susceptible to disease and mutation, creating a feedback loop that accelerates the collapse. Disease runs rampant through the population. The normal plagues of hive life are bad enough, but now they're compounded by mutations that create new diseases, and by Nurgle-influenced contagions that spread with supernatural speed. Medici facilities are overwhelmed within days, and then abandoned as their staff succumb to plague or flee. The sick die in the streets, their bodies left to rot because there's no one to deal with them. The stench of decay permeates everything, and survivors who breathe it know they might be the next to fall ill. In some areas, particularly the Underhive, order never existed, and chaos is simply business as usual, but amplified. The difference is that now the chaos isn't contained anymore. The violence and disorder spread upward, through the hive, no longer held in check by imperial authority. The Underhive's gangs and mutant communities pour into the mid and upper levels, bringing their wars with them. Entire sectors become battlegrounds between forces that have no loyalty to anything but their own survival. The mental health of the survivors deteriorates rapidly. Constant fear, lack of sleep, malnutrition, exposure to warp phenomena, and the trauma of watching their world collapse all take their toll. People hear voices that aren't there. They see threats everywhere, becoming paranoid to the point of madness. Some retreat into catatonia, simply shutting down mentally in the face of horrors they can't process. Others become manic, laughing hysterically at the absurdity of their situation, or engaging in violence with gleeful abandon. Children suffer, especially. They don't have the context to understand what's happening, only that the adults who should protect them are terrified, or gone, or transformed into monsters. Many are orphaned when their parents die or mutate or join cults. These children form feral packs, surviving however they can in the ruins of their world. Some are recruited by cults, molded into faithful servants of chaos from a young age. Others simply try to survive day to day, aging far too quickly as they witness horrors no child should see. Through all of this collapse, there are still those who resist. Imperial loyalists who maintain their faith despite everything that's happening. Soldiers and Arbites who continue to fight for order even when it seems hopeless. Civilians who organize to protect their communities and help the vulnerable. Their courage is admirable, but ultimately futile. The forces arrayed against them are too great, too fundamental. They're trying to hold back the tide with their bare hands, and the cultists watch the collapse with satisfaction, seeing it as the necessary destruction that must precede their god's triumph. They don't realize that they, too, will be consumed by what they've unleashed. The Chaos Gods care nothing for the survival of their mortal servants. When the time comes, the cultists will be devoured along with everyone else. But for now, in their ignorance, they celebrate the end of the Imperium's control and prepare to welcome their dark masters into the material world. The Imperial response, when help becomes horror. When word of a world's corruption reaches Imperial authorities, the response is supposed to be swift and decisive. The Inquisition dispatches agents to investigate. The Imperial Navy mobilizes warships. Regiments of the Astra Militarum are diverted from other campaigns. Help is coming. Salvation is at hand. Or so the desperate population believes. The reality is far more terrible. The Imperial response to chaos corruption is not rescue but quarantine and purge. The Imperium's doctrine is clear: better to destroy a world than risk the corruption spreading. When an Inquisitor arrives to assess the situation, they're not looking for ways to save the population. They're determining how far the taint has spread and whether exterminatus is necessary. The first forces to arrive are often reconnaissance elements, inquisitorial agents, special operations units, or Space Marine scouts sent to gather intelligence. What they find in their investigations determines everything that follows. If the corruption is contained to certain areas and the planetary government is still functional, there might be hope for a conventional purge. If the warp's influence has spread too far, if demons have manifested, if the very fabric of reality is failing, then there's only one solution. For the population, the arrival of Imperial forces initially brings hope. They've prayed for deliverance, and here it is. The God Emperor's angels of death come to save them. In cities where order still exists, people gather to welcome the arriving troops. They offer what information they have about cult activities. They point out neighbors they suspect of corruption. They pledge their loyalty and beg for protection. The Imperial response to this welcome is terrifying in its efficiency and brutality. The forces don't distinguish between the innocent and the guilty. Anyone who has survived on a corrupted world is suspect. Anyone who has witnessed chaos manifestations has been tainted by that knowledge, even if they remained loyal. The doctrine is clear: kill them all and let the Emperor sort out the innocent. The purge begins with quarantine. No one is allowed to leave the world. Any ships attempting to flee are destroyed by the blockading fleet. Vox transmissions are jammed or monitored, preventing any communication with the outside galaxy. The world is sealed, its population trapped with the horrors they've experienced and the new horrors the Imperial forces will inflict. Then comes the sorting. The population is rounded up and processed through screening stations. Inquisitorial agents backed by armed soldiers examine each person for signs of mutation, taint, or corruption. The standards are impossibly strict. A small mutation that appeared through no fault of the victim's own. Execution. Exposure to warp phenomena. Execution. Membership in any organization that might have been infiltrated by cultists. Execution. Knowledge of chaos symbols or entities. Execution. Even those who pass the initial screening aren't safe. They might be subjected to psychic probing by inquisitorial psychers, brutal mental examinations that leave survivors traumatized and often brain damaged. They're interrogated for hours or days about what they witnessed, who they knew, what they did. The interrogations use methods that would be considered torture in any other context, but the Inquisition doesn't care about suspects' rights or comfort. They care about rooting out every last trace of corruption, and if innocents suffer in the process, that's acceptable collateral damage. The survivors of screening face an uncertain fate. The truly lucky might be deemed pure enough to be allowed to live, though their freedom is far from guaranteed. They might be pressed into service as indentured laborers on other imperial worlds, spending the rest of their lives in penal colonies or manufactorums under constant supervision. They might be mind-wiped, their memories of chaos corruption erased along with much of their personality and identity, leaving them empty shells who can be trusted because they remember nothing. Many aren't even given these options. The Inquisition follows a policy called containment through elimination, simply killing everyone who had significant exposure to chaos. This includes not just cultists, but their victims, witnesses, survivors, anyone who might carry knowledge or taint forward. Entire cities are purged, their populations herded into designated areas and executed en masse. The bodies are burned to ash to ensure no corruption remains. For those areas where overt chaos activity is occurring, the response is even more extreme. Space Marines deploy in force, conducting surgical strikes against cult strongholds. These operations aren't about capturing cultists for interrogation. They're about extermination. The Adeptus Astartes shows no mercy, killing everyone in affected areas, regardless of whether they're cultists or simply people trapped in the wrong place at the wrong time. Flamers purge entire hab blocks. Bolter rounds shred human flesh without discrimination. The Space Marines' mission is to eradicate chaos worship root and branch, and they pursue this mission with terrifying zeal. The Inquisition employs other assets as well. The Adepta Sororitas, the militant arm of the ecclesiarchy, conducts their own purges with fanatical devotion. They see themselves as the Emperor's vengeance made manifest, and show no more mercy than the Space Marines. Assassins from the Officio Assassinorum hunt down cult leaders and other high-value targets, eliminating them with precision before melting back into the shadows. Entire regiments of the Astra Militarum deploy to occupy cities and hunt cultists through the ruins. The population caught between chaos cultists and Imperial purge forces faces an impossible situation. The cultists want to sacrifice them or transform them into twisted servants of the dark gods. The Imperial forces view them as acceptable casualties in the fight against corruption. There's no safe haven, no way to prove innocence, no protection for the truly faithful. All they can do is try to survive day by day and hope that somehow they'll be deemed pure enough to spare. Some Imperial forces take a more measured approach, working to identify and protect the truly innocent while eliminating actual cultists. These commanders understand that indiscriminate slaughter only feeds the Chaos God's power and creates martyrs that strengthen cult recruitment. But these rational voices are often overruled by more radical elements who see any hesitation as weakness or potential corruption. The debate over how to conduct the purge can paralyze the Imperial response or lead to different factions of Imperial forces working at cross purposes. Meanwhile, the world continues to deteriorate. The combat between Imperial forces and cultists creates more destruction, more death, more suffering. Battles rage through populated areas, killing civilians caught in the crossfire. Infrastructure that was barely functional is destroyed completely. Refugees flee from fighting only to be caught in new battles elsewhere. The chaos that the imperial forces were supposed to suppress instead intensifies. And then there's the ultimate sanction, exterminatus. If an inquisitor determines that the corruption is too deep, that saving the world would cost more in resources than it's worth, or that there's significant risk of the taint spreading off-world, they can order the planet's destruction. This decision is not made lightly, but when it's made, it's absolute. Exterminatus can take many forms. Cyclonic torpedoes that create firestorms engulfing entire continents. Virus bombs that kill all organic life within hours. Atmospheric incinerator torpedoes that literally set the sky on fire. Two-stage exterminatus that uses virus bombs to kill the population and then ignites their rotting bodies to scour the surface clean. The method varies, but the result is always the same. Total death for everything on the world. For the population, learning that exterminatus has been ordered is the final horror. They survived chaos corruption, they survived the purges, and now they're to be killed anyway, not because they're guilty, but because their world is deemed too tainted to save. There's no escape. The orbital blockade ensures no one gets off the planet. There's no reprieve. Once exterminatus is ordered, it will be carried out. All they can do is wait for the end, which comes as fire from the sky that consumes everything. Some try to flee underground, seeking shelter in the deepest parts of the underhive or in ancient bunkers. But exterminatus is thorough. The heat penetrates deep into the planet's crust. The atmosphere burns away, leaving nothing but airless rock. Those who thought themselves safe in shelters die of suffocation or are cooked alive as their refuges become ovens. A few might survive in exceptionally deep and well-sealed bunkers, but they emerge to find a dead world where nothing lives and nothing grows, condemned to a slow death by starvation on the barren rock their home has become. Not all worlds reach the point of exterminatus. Some are deemed salvageable after sufficient purging. But even these saved worlds are forever changed. Their populations are decimated, their infrastructure destroyed, their history erased. The Inquisition scrubs all records of what happened, leaving only sanitized accounts that teach future generations nothing useful. The survivors are relocated or mind-wiped. The world is repopulated with colonists who know nothing of its dark history, and the cycle continues because the Imperium never truly learns from these catastrophes, never addresses the underlying conditions that make worlds vulnerable to chaos corruption in the first place. For the Imperium, this is all acceptable. Billions might die, entire worlds might be rendered lifeless, but the alternative, allowing chaos to establish a foothold that could spread to other worlds, is worse. The calculus is simple. Sacrifice one world to potentially save 100. It doesn't matter that most of the people killed were loyal imperial citizens who never chose corruption. It doesn't matter that many might have been saved with more care and effort. What matters is certainty, absolute surety that the taint has been eliminated. And the only way to achieve that certainty is through overwhelming force and total destruction. This is the help that arrives when you pray for deliverance from chaos. This is the salvation the Imperium offers, and for many who experience it, the horror of the cure is as great as the horror of the disease. The tragedy is that the Imperium's brutal response is, from their perspective, the only rational choice. In a universe where chaos corruption can spread like plague, and where the fate of entire sectors might hang on preventing that spread, mercy and careful discrimination are luxuries they cannot afford. But for those on the receiving end of this utilitarian calculus, the logic offers no comfort as the flames descend. The final days, reality unravels. The final days before a world falls completely to chaos are unlike anything most humans can survive witnessing without losing their sanity. Reality doesn't just bend, it breaks. The distinction between the material universe and the immaterium collapses. The laws of physics that govern existence cease to function. What remains is a nightmare realm where anything is possible and everything is horrible. The sky changes in ways that defy description. It's no longer blue or grey or any color that belongs in normal reality. It pulses and writhes like living flesh. Faces appear in the clouds, vast and terrible, watching the world below with malevolent interest. The stars rearrange themselves into patterns that hurt to look at, geometries that suggest meanings the human brain wasn't designed to process. Sometimes the sky opens, revealing glimpses of the warp beyond, impossible vistas of entities and places that should not exist. The land itself becomes alive and hostile. Mountains move, rising and falling like the chest of a sleeping giant. Valleys open up like mouths, filled with teeth made of stone that grind together. Rivers run with blood or acid, or substances that have no name in any human language. The ground beneath people's feet becomes unstable, sometimes solid, sometimes liquid, sometimes simply not there at all. Buildings that have stood for millennia twist and reshape themselves, their architecture becoming non-Euclidean nightmares of impossible angles and rooms that exist in more or fewer than 3 dimensions. Mass possession events occur as the barrier between worlds fails completely. Entire populations become hosts to demonic entities all at once. One moment they're people, desperate and afraid but still human. The next, they're screaming as demons force their way into their bodies, wearing their flesh like ill-fitting suits. The possessed might retain some awareness, trapped inside their own bodies as passengers to their own destruction, forced to watch through their own eyes as demons use their hands to commit atrocities. These possessed individuals don't look fully human anymore. Their features shift and warp as the demon within struggles to maintain the mortal form. Eyes change color or multiply. Limbs move at wrong angles. Voices become overlaid with others, speaking in tongues that predate humanity or in sounds that aren't language at all, but direct transmissions of thought and emotion. They display impossible strength, tearing apart others with their bare hands, breaking through doors and walls, climbing surfaces no human should be able to scale. The possessed often gather in groups, drawn together by their demonic occupants' will. They conduct rituals in public spaces, chanting and dancing, and committing acts of violence and depravity that serve to thin the veil even further. These gatherings create zones of intense warp activity, where reality is especially unstable, where demons can manifest more easily, where anyone caught nearby risks possession or worse. Some of the possessed eventually burn out, the demon consuming their host entirely until only a twisted corpse remains. Others are transformed into something stable but monstrous, demon-human hybrids that retain a parody of life but no longer resemble the person they once were. Still, others simply vanish, pulled entirely into the warp along with their possessors, their screams echoing from nowhere as they're dragged into a realm of eternal torment. For those not yet possessed, survival becomes a matter of pure luck. There's no pattern to who gets taken and who doesn't. No way to protect yourself beyond avoiding areas of obvious warp activity. But as more and more of the world becomes saturated with corruption, avoiding such areas becomes impossible. Everywhere is dangerous. Nowhere is safe. You might go to sleep human and wake up a demon's puppet, or you might maintain your identity, but watch as everyone you know loses theirs. Temporal distortions reach their peak. The same minute might repeat endlessly, people trapped in a loop they're helplessly aware of. Or time might accelerate wildly, years passing in what feels like hours. People age decades in days, their bodies crumbling to dust even as their minds remain aware. Others are frozen in time, standing like statues while the world changes around them, then suddenly unstuck and experiencing all the missed time at once. The dead rise en masse. Every corpse that hasn't been properly cremated becomes a potential vessel for warp entities. Graveyards disgorge their contents. Mortuary facilities become scenes of nightmare as the dead shamble forth. These animated corpses aren't traditional undead. They're puppeted by minor demons or fragments of warp energy, and they behave with malign intelligence. They hunt the living, seeking to add more bodies to their ranks. Some speak with the voices of those they once were, using knowledge of their former relationships to manipulate and betray those who loved them. The survivors' senses become unreliable. They see things that aren't there and fail to see things that are. They hear voices constantly, sometimes external, sometimes seeming to come from inside their own heads. Touch becomes untrustworthy. Solid surfaces might give way like water, or empty air might feel as solid as steel. Taste and smell are overwhelmed by the stench of corruption and the taste of ashes. Some lose their senses entirely, going blind or deaf or losing all feeling, their bodies shutting down to protect their minds from further input. Madness spreads like contagion. Those who've managed to maintain their sanity up to this point finally break under the strain of impossibility made manifest. They might laugh hysterically at sights that would make sane people weep. They might retreat into fantasy, constructing elaborate delusions to replace the unbearable reality. They might simply shut down, becoming catatonic and unresponsive. Or they might be driven to violence, attacking anything and anyone in rage at what's been done to their world. Some of the mad claim to have revelations, insights into the nature of chaos, or visions of what's to come. They might actually be experiencing genuine psychic phenomena, their breaking minds briefly touching the warp and bringing back fragments of truth mixed with madness. They prophesy doom or salvation, speak in riddles and contradictions, draw symbols that seem to move and breathe. Following their guidance is as likely to lead to disaster as safety, but in a world where nothing makes sense, their nonsensical advice is no worse than anyone else's. The last bastions of resistance fight desperate battles against overwhelming odds. Small groups of survivors band together, imperial loyalists, making a final stand against the corruption. They fortify whatever positions they can, arm themselves with whatever weapons they find, and prepare to die fighting rather than surrender to chaos. Some are military personnel, still trying to fulfill their duty. Others are civilians who refuse to give up. A few are even former cultists who finally understand what they've unleashed and seek redemption through resistance. These pockets of resistance can't win. They lack the numbers, the resources, and most critically, they're fighting an enemy that can't be defeated with conventional weapons. But they fight anyway, because fighting gives them purpose, because dying in battle is preferable to transformation or possession, because some part of them still believes that if they can hold out just a little longer, help might arrive. It doesn't, of course. Help isn't coming. The Imperium has already written this world off. The landscape continues to transform. Familiar landmarks disappear or change beyond recognition. New geography appears, towers of bone, forests of crystallized screams, rivers of time that flow backward. The boundaries between locations become fluid. A door might open into a different city or a different world entirely. Maps become useless as roads lead to destinations that change with each journey. The concept of distance loses meaning when places can be adjacent one moment and separated by impossible gulfs the next. Certain areas become even more corrupted, transforming into demon worlds in miniature. These zones exist partially in both reality and the warp simultaneously, operating under whatever rules the controlling demon decides to impose. Gravity might work sideways. Light might cast darkness instead of illumination. The inhabitants might find themselves repeating the same actions forever, trapped in cycles of torment specifically designed by sadistic entities. These zones expand slowly, consuming more of the world, and anyone caught in their expansion is trapped forever. Animals and plants undergo final transformations. Creatures that were merely mutated before become something entirely new, species that have never existed in nature and violate every principle of biology. Plants develop awareness and malice, their thorns becoming weapons, their pollen carrying not allergies, but madness. Some organisms merge together into chimeric horrors that combine the worst aspects of multiple species. The entire ecosystem becomes hostile to human life, as if the planet itself is rejecting its former inhabitants. The few remaining functional technologies fail completely. Machines that somehow kept working despite everything give up. Their machine spirits finally corrupted beyond function. Lights go out permanently. Life support systems cease. Communication devices emit only screams and static. The technological infrastructure that made civilization possible on this world is dead, leaving survivors to face the end with nothing but what they can hold in their hands. Through all of this, the cultists who started it all often meet their own ends. The Chaos Gods rarely reward their mortal servants with the glory they were promised. Some are consumed in the final rituals that complete their world's fall. Others are sacrificed by their cult leaders to gain favor with the Dark Gods. Still others transform into chaos spawn, mindless monsters that represent the ultimate failure. Only a very few might be elevated to demonhood or taken into the Eye of Terror to serve their gods in the warp. For most cultists, the victory they work toward becomes their own destruction. These are the final days, the last moments before reality surrenders completely to chaos. What comes next is not really life as any human would understand it. The world will become a demon world, a place where the warp and reality exist in a twisted union. But for the people experiencing these final days, what comes next doesn't matter. They're living in hell made manifest, watching their world die, knowing that their own end approaches. All they can do is survive from one moment to the next, bearing witness to the ultimate corruption of everything they knew, until finally, even that ability fails, and they too are consumed by the darkness. Demonic incursion, when hell comes to life. The moment demons manifest in real space marks the point of no return. Until this happens, no matter how corrupted a world has become, there's still theoretical hope of redemption. But once demons cross the barrier between the warp and reality in significant numbers, the world is doomed. What follows is an invasion from another dimension, an assault by entities that exist purely as manifestations of thought and emotion, given horrible form. Demons don't appear all at once like a conventional invasion. They seep through wherever the barrier is weakest, materializing in places where rituals have been performed, where large numbers of people have died violently, where reality is especially thin. At first, they might appear only briefly, flickering in and out of existence, like images projected from a faulty hololith. But as more warp energy flows into the world, their manifestations become more stable, more permanent, more numerous. The demons of Khorne arrive first in most cases, drawn by the violence and bloodshed that accompanies societal collapse. Bloodletters, lesser demons who appear as crimson-skinned warriors with sword-like horns, materialize in the midst of battles and massacres. They're surrounded by an aura of rage that infects everyone nearby, turning even mild-mannered civilians into frenzied killers. The bloodletters attack with savage efficiency, their hellblades cutting through armor and flesh with equal ease. They kill not for any strategic purpose, but simply because killing is their reason for existence. Behind the bloodletters come other servants of the blood god. Flesh hounds, demon beasts with skulls for heads, hunt down psychers and those touched by magic. Juggernauts, massive demon engines that are part creature and part machine, charge through defenders like they're not even there. And occasionally, in places of supreme violence, a bloodthirster might manifest. A greater demon of Khorne, a towering engine of destruction that can lay waste to entire armies single-handedly. Its very presence drives mortals mad with rage, and its whip and axe kill with every strike. The experience of facing Khornate daemons is one of overwhelming, primal terror mixed with Incomprehensible rage. Survivors report that being near these entities makes them want to kill, to rend and tear and destroy, even as they're terrified of what's happening to them. The bloodletter's crimson skin glistens in impossible ways. Their horns pulse with energy. Their eyes burn with literal flames. They move with inhuman speed and grace. And when they speak, which is rare, their voices sound like grinding metal and screaming fury. Nurgle's demons follow a different pattern. They manifest in places of disease and decay, emerging from piles of corpses or pools of toxic waste. Plague-bearers shuffle forward in organized ranks, their rotting bodies crawling with disease, their single eyes staring with dull malevolence. They're methodical rather than frenzied, counting each blow they strike, tallying the deaths they cause in service to their master's endless calculations. They spread contagion simply by existing. The air around them becomes thick with flies and spores, and anyone who breathes it risks succumbing to supernatural plagues. Nurgle's greater demons, the great unclean ones, are obscenely corpulent giants that embody decay and entropy. They're strangely jovial, laughing at the horror they cause, offering blessings to those they kill. Their bodies are hosts to countless diseases, and they shed plagues like humans shed skin cells. But perhaps worse than the obvious horror is their message: that decay is natural, that embracing corruption brings peace, that Grandfather Nurgle loves all his children. Some broken survivors actually accept these lies, allowing themselves to be transformed into plague carriers in exchange for an end to their suffering. The demons of Tzeentch are perhaps the most alien and incomprehensible. Pink and blue horrors, crystalline entities that split and reform endlessly, appear in places of psychic activity or where the barriers between reality and the warp are thinnest. They hurl bolts of warp fire that transform whatever they touch into something else entirely. A human might become a pile of writhing tentacles. A building might turn into a screaming obelisk of living crystal. The ground might become a gateway into another dimension. Tzeentch's sorcerers and lords of change, his greater demons, manipulate reality itself with their magic. They can see possible futures and arrange circumstances to bring about the outcomes they desire. Fighting them is an exercise in futility because they've already seen every move you might make.